Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story begins with two children having fun playing on the swings and having fun. The boy asked a girl named Nuna to push him harder, and when she did, he even jumped off the swing and fell right into the water. He was having incredible fun and Nu herself was splashed with water, but she wasn't upset about it. She was excited to play with him too. When the boy came ashore, he said that it was incredibly great, and also suggested that she try it herself because it is a lot of cool emotions. Nuna looked at this swing and wasn't sure, for jumping into the river didn't seem like such a safe pastime to her, for one could hurt oneself very badly. Then she looked at her friend and realized that nothing had happened to him, of course, and he would even become the strongest in the country in the future. However, the girl knew perfectly well that for her this fun, an instant ticket to the other world, to death closer. They were silent for a while. The boy started wiping his wet face, then turned to her and told her it was really a lot of fun, so she'd better try it so she wouldn't regret it later. He suddenly became very angry and looked at her with the sternest look, and then wondered if she really wouldn't try it. Nuna had nothing else to do but agree. She stood on the swing and her friend started swinging, and she said it was very exciting and started laughing loudly. Then he rocked her even harder and told her to jump. The girl didn't expect such a turn, so she was even a little confused. But because her friend pushed her really hard, she couldn't stay on the swing, and so she jumped straight into the water. Nuna fell into the water and covered her mouth with her hands. She felt herself begin to choke as the water was getting into her mouth, and her lungs were getting worse and worse. At that moment, she realized that apparently all her efforts had been in vain, and there was no way she could escape the death that awaited her around every corner. In her past life, she was the most ordinary grad student, a diligent student who agrees to all of her professor's suggestions, and even something as silly as team building in the mountains. Their chief counselor looked at all the workers and said that they were young, healthy, and had absolutely no stamina. This really annoyed him because he was already at quite such a big age, but still liked to do sports. The girl, in turn, apologized to the professor, but said that he has just amazing physical preparation, and it is very hard for them to keep up with him. He is ready to run a marathon at such a speed. She herself was incredibly angry, because he'd gotten her out of the house on her legal day off, and while she'd had to stay late in the lab the previous day because of him, she also thought that if he'd had any conscience at all, he would have let her spend Saturday at home. A few more hours passed, and finally they reached the top. The professor smiled and said that the place hadn't changed at all since he was a student himself. All the students, who were also made to participate in this activity, sat down to catch their breath a bit, and he said that it was an incredibly marvelous view and should definitely be captured on camera. The girl stood up, picking up her cell phone, and told the professor that she was pretty good at taking pictures. When the counselor heard this, he said that in that case, she could take pictures of him, and she shouldn't forget about the beautiful background either. He wanted him to be very visible. The girl started taking pictures of it and said it was just wonderful. The pictures come out great and said it was probably because the model was good. The professor suddenly became indignant and said that from this distance he was covering the entire background. So he asked that she move a little farther away. The girl agreed. However, she did not notice that in the middle of her path was a huge cliff. Her feet did not hold on because she was also wearing flip-flops, which were easily torn. And in a second, she began to fall downward. She hit the ground with her head and her whole body, and while she was still alive, she couldn't believe she was going to die there. But when she realized that this was how she was destined to die, she suddenly felt someone pulling her by the arm. It was the boy she had been playing with all this time. He pulled her to shore and started shaking her, telling her to wake up. When Nuna heard the familiar voice, she immediately realized it was her younger brother. Then she coughed and told him to calm down because she was all right. In fact, the girl wanted him to let her go, for he had a very strong grip, and she thought at that moment that he would really become the best athlete. Her brother suddenly frowned and said that she had really scared him, and asked if she had decided to pretend to be a corpse again for fun. Nuna laughed nervously and said that it was indeed true and apologized, saying that she had gone a little overboard. She also said she wouldn't do it again and offered to play a little more to dispel the awkwardness. In fact, her brother's name was Kieran, and the girl knew very well that he already hated her very much. So she had to indulge him in everything in order to survive and secure her future. She used to jump on her hind legs in front of the professor, but now she has to do it in front of her little brother. In fact, in her new life, when she was just a child, her parents died quite early on. And the other people who stood at the funeral didn't know what to do with the girl now. They didn't know where to put her, because they already had as many as 5 children. In fact, when she fell off the cliff where she had taken the teacher's picture, somehow she opened her eyes, already standing in the middle of a cemetery she had never been to. Everything around her was unfamiliar. The woman standing next to her was very indignant with the other people, not understanding how they wanted to dump her on them since they were already familiar with their dire situation and just couldn't do that. Nuna, for her part, just stood there, not realizing what was going on. When she began to examine herself, she realized that she was completely out of her body. First, the girl's hands were too small, and she realized that she had somehow found herself in the body of a child, and she was barely tall enough to reach the waist of the woman standing next to her. Nuna also realized that there were people around her arguing about something, and right in front of her were 2 new coffins. She guessed that she was in the body of an orphan, a poor orphan who was not welcomed by anyone. She realized that she was in the body of an orphan, a poor orphan who was not welcome. Then suddenly one of the women pushed the girl forward, telling them to take her away, for they could not take her for themselves. The other strangers were outraged and pushed her toward the coffins, saying they certainly weren't going to take her away. Nuna was ready to cry. She was sick of this situation, so she thought that it would be better to give her to an orphanage than to divide a child that nobody wanted among themselves like this. Then one of the people suggested that she should really be given to an orphanage, because rumor has it that there are no girls at all in orphanages now, and that's a big problem. This shortage was so huge that the workers were even willing to pay to have this girl given to them. Then the people who were standing around immediately looked at her with great greed in their eyes. Nuna realized that she was not going to be well, so she started running away from them. Immediately, people ran after her, telling her to stop and telling themselves that they had to catch her. Of course, the girl was not going to obey adults in such a situation, and she decided that the best way would be to live alone, rather than in that orphanage, where it was unclear how she would be treated. But at that moment she was running so fast that she didn't notice the rock she had tripped over. Nuna started to fly forward, but landed on something soft. It was some girl who had miraculously been there to catch her. She took the baby in her arms and asked if she was all right. Nuna looked at her in surprise and couldn't believe her happiness, because the couple looked so happy and peaceful. But at that moment, the people from the cemetery had already come running. They saw the girl and turned to Reina, the woman who was holding her, and told her to give her back to them. Nuna, in turn, hugged the stranger and started screaming, asking her not to do it, because these people wanted to sell her into slavery, and she certainly didn't want to end up there. Reina hugged the girl tighter and looked at those people with an angry look, saying, "Is it really true?" People were immediately worried that the girl might not be given away. Then they unanimously said that it was just a misunderstanding, and that the little girl had misunderstood them. One of the men scratched the back of his head and, reaching forward, said that the girl would simply go to an orphanage, and slavery was out of the question. The man stood up for his wife by stepping forward and said that since they wanted to give this child to the orphanage anyway, they wanted to take her for themselves. The man laughed and asked if they really wanted them to trust and give such a precious child to some strangers who were suddenly immediately interested in her. He also added that they should at least make sure that they could raise and maintain her properly. But at this point, the man pulled out a bag of gold and asked if it would be enough to close all questions. When people saw this bag of money, they immediately got excited, and the man said he thought the young parents would do well, so they could take her. That same evening, Nuna traveled with these strangers in a carriage to their estate. She still couldn't understand what was happening, but she felt in her heart that it would be better than slavery. Reina, who was sitting next to the baby, stroked her head and wondered if she was so scared. She also apologized and said they should have come early. The girl looked at them in surprise and asked if they really knew who she even was. The woman smiled and replied that of course they knew exactly who she was, since she and her mom were the best of friends. Nuna, hearing this, was very surprised. Then Reina explained that her mother, like herself, had been born into a noble family and was quite famous in social circles, and had run away with her father. The events were unfolding so rapidly that it was impossible to keep track of them. But she smiled and told the girl not to worry, for now they would take good care of her, and she would not grow up without a family. Nuna looked at the girl in surprise, and couldn't believe that she had just taken in a complete stranger's child, whom she hardly knew at all. But she didn't really think much of it in that situation, because she had nowhere to go anyway. She didn't want to be abandoned again, so she hugged the woman and fell asleep until she arrived at the estate. As soon as they went inside, the girl saw a great many rooms that were arranged very richly, and her eyes went from side to side. Nuna thought about the fact that if heaven really existed, it would probably look exactly like this beautiful estate. As soon as they entered, the man turned to the boy who was standing at the top of the stairs. It was Kieran, and he immediately began to descend. He was a little flustered, but he said hello to his parents and also to the strange girl. When she saw his beautiful face, she thought he was an incredibly cute kid. He had very long eyelashes and chubby cheeks that were all ruddy because of the excitement. Nuna thought he was an incredibly cute little boy. Then father told Kieran to get to know him because it was Nuna, she was now a member of their family. Then the man turned to the girl herself and said that it was Kieran. They only had a 2-year age difference, so he thought they could easily get along. The boy immediately reached forward to meet and greet her. Kieran smiled a little and said he was very happy to meet her and greeted her. Nuna couldn't think of anything else but how cute he was, and she wanted to touch his cheeks. They were so sweet. But she was able to contain her desires and held out her hand to him in return, smiling, saying that she really hoped they could become friends, and greeted him too. Then she came closer and touched his cheek. She felt very nice and sweet and thought that his cheeks felt like Modi. She couldn't stop herself from touching them. The boy just watched it all for a while. But then he became very uncomfortable and looked angrily at his new acquaintance. Nuna felt a little uncomfortable, so she quickly removed her hand, realizing that he didn't feel good about what she was doing. It was actually the day the girl first met the most powerful man in high society and became his errand dog. The girl was silent for a while, but when she saw that he was getting even angrier, she immediately apologized and said that he was very nice, so she couldn't contain herself. Her mother came closer to her and, putting her arm around her shoulders, told her son that she apparently liked him very much, so she asked him not to get so angry. She then asked Kieran if he liked Nuna at all. The boy was silent for a while, then said in a cold voice that he liked her. And when the girl heard about it, she directly shone with joy. She really could not believe that he said those words. Then he smiled slyly and, turning to his mother, asked if he could show Nuna their house. Reina, when she heard this, said that of course it was very good that they were able to be friends, and that he was so determined to take care of her. He took her by the hand and began to lead her off somewhere to the side, saying he would show her her new room. As the boy started up the stairs, Nuna giggled. I don't know how I can keep from slapping that little boy on the butt, but she too followed her little brother. However, because she was too absorbed in looking at his appearance, she missed a step and suddenly flew down the stairs. Kieran didn't even turn around. He told her to be careful and meet the step from above. After all, it is special, fake. It is such a trap for enemies. Nuna, who had hit the ground hard as she lay on the floor, thought about the fact that he had had a very timely epiphany that she should be warned about this. But the girl managed to keep herself from crying, so she got up and ran after her brother. Soon they came to her new room. Kieran ushered her forward and told her that this was the room she would now live in. There was a lot of space. Everything around it was pink, and there were lots of toys and presents of all kinds. Nuna walked forward and looked around and was delighted, for this room was larger than her apartment in her previous life. But at that moment a boy came to the window and, pulling the rope, said there was a 100-year-old canopy in that spot. And when he did, a lot of dust came out of the cloth. They both started coughing, and the boy even laughed because of the look on his new sister's face. Nuna, seeing how much dust was in that canopy, was suddenly wary. She didn't know if he had done it on purpose. After all, when she fell there on the stairs, he hadn't even turned around. She was still starting to think about different things. But at that moment, Kieran looked at her. the boy stepping closer and asking if she was all right. The girl smiled and said she was fine, and the fabric was insanely beautiful. In fact, her whole body was covered in dirt and dust because of what he had done. Nuna tried to reassure herself, thinking that he had come over and started to worry about her, so the girl assumed she had just misunderstood him the first time. She also thought about the fact that he was still very young, and so he wouldn't have bullied her on purpose. Of course, she truly believed it, but it was definitely not like that, and the girl realized it after a while, living in the manor. Kieran was always finding some way to make fun of her. When he went to show her the bathroom, he spilled it all over her. The boy went to the sink and said that all bathrooms are enchanted, so she had to be careful, because as soon as she opened the faucet, the water immediately poured out, and he demonstrated it clearly. And then made a very surprised look when he saw his sister all doused in water, and asked what had happened to her. After that, they went into another room and he began to show her the fireplace. The boy said that if she pressed sideways, a fire would immediately start in the fireplace. Nuna bent down low enough to get a closer look at it, and in that second the fireplace suddenly lit up, and she was very frightened. Kieran, for his part, started laughing loudly. The girl, who'd written off what she'd initially thought was childish clumsiness, was repeating it over and over again, so she began to have doubts. As they walked on, she still couldn't stand it and asked her brother if he was doing all this on purpose. The boy who was walking ahead suddenly stopped and looked at her in surprise and asked what she even meant by that. Nuna was very indignant and asked if it was really possible to abuse people like that, even with people you don't know. Then he came closer to her and looked her straight in the eye and asked her how she could answer him, if she would tell her parents about all this. The girl looked up and said that of course she would have to report this to her parents if he continued to act like this. Kieran then looked at her angrily. He said in a quiet voice that apparently she still didn't understand something. Then slowly drawing out each word, he said that if they couldn't get along, it wasn't him they would kick out, but her. For he was their own son, and she was some stranger off the street. Nuna tried to hold back her tears, but realized that he was really right. For this boy was a deadly cute child, and she was just an ordinary girl who had been orphaned. Yeah, from the Duchess she wasn't that close. This girl only supports her out of respect for her late mother. However, she doesn't want to be sold to the orphanage. Therefore, she needed to do something about it. Nuna balled her hands into fists. She wondered if he disliked her that much. The boy was very surprised at this question and said that of course he didn't like her. She was very surprised and asked why that was so, since she hadn't even managed to do anything bad to him. Kieran was silent for a while. Then he smiled and told her to think hard on her own as to why that might be. After that, he ran off ahead, leaving the girl alone. She was incredibly surprised and didn't know what she should even realize. Nuna's hand wrapped around the wall next to her and thought about how he was impossible to endure. Then the girl turned to the man in the portrait and asked if he could help her deal with his ancestor. But when she looked up, she suddenly saw a noble man. Then decided to read the title of this portrait. The name Estir was written there, along with the fact that the man was a 35th generation duke. When she saw the name, she realized that it sounded very familiar to her. Several times she began to repeat his name. Then suddenly another name came to her mind, Kieran Istira. She knew immediately that this was the strongest person in social circles, the protagonist of a novel she had read in a past life when she was still a student. This is a perfect in everything young man. The only flaw he had was that he was horrible, simply in character. The girl also remembered that he had an older sister, simply Ludinka. However, despite the fact that she was only the Duke's adopted daughter, she had a lot of insolence and arrogance. This girl was constantly bullied by her sister-in-law, the protagonist of the novel, and she eventually died at the hands of her own adopted brother. And now, as Nuna stood near this portrait, she felt very uncomfortable. She felt a heaviness in her chest. She didn't understand why the boy hated her right now. After all, she hadn't managed to do anything bad to him yet. Then she thought about the fact that he might have been angry about their unfortunate first meeting. And that was a distinct possibility. All because Kieran is incredibly proud, and he probably didn't like the fact that she touched his face without permission. In fact, in the novel, he was just a nasty character. He is a terribly vindictive man who punishes anyone for the slightest mistake. The girl couldn't stay on her feet. She fell to the ground and thought that she was really finished. She was still upset for a while, but then she pulled herself together, realizing that she couldn't give up so easily. There was only one way out for her. Nuna came up with one plan, and now she's been watching the boy for 5 days and wants to figure out how she can get him to like her at all. Unfortunately, however, her efforts have gotten her nowhere so far. She just watches him do his thing every day. Nuna noticed that he seemed to enjoy practicing alone. The boy liked archery, and he was quite good at it. She also thought about the fact that if she couldn't find a way to get along with him, her way snow me teach me that target too, because he hit the target clearly. At this point, Kieran was about to head back to the manor, and as he passed the bushes, he noticed his new sister. The boy turned to her and wondered what she was doing in the bushes. Nuna felt a little awkward. She didn't know what to say to him, so she kept silent. But he moved closer to her and said that he knew she was following him. He had noticed her several times. The girl got to her feet and replied that she really just wanted to be friends with him and had nothing bad in mind. But Kieran turned around and started to walk away, saying that he didn't want to be friends with her and asked that she not try so hard anymore. Nuna was very nervous and couldn't believe that if she gave up now, she would become his target. She didn't know what she could make him even slightly interested in, but then she looked at the training field and offered to fetch an arrow for him so he wouldn't have to run around too much. She ran up and started to take out the arrow, saying that she would practice together. She couldn't, of course, but she was always willing to help, so she asked him to do the dirty work for her. But the moment she tried to pull the arrow out, a new one flew in, a centimeter from her hand. Nuna was very frightened, and her whole body began to tremble with fear. She thought about the fact that if it had been just a little longer, he would have just grazed her head or pierced her arm. At this point, the guy turned to her and wondered why she was just standing there. He pretended as if nothing had happened. Nuna immediately snapped back to reality and took the second arrow as well, saying that it would be coming up now. When she ran up close to her brother, as she handed the arrow to him, she said that he was a very good shot, and she liked how clearly he could hit the target. Kieran looked at her in surprise, then asked if she really thought that. The girl, smiling, said that of course he is quite like a true knight. He managed to catch her off guard and she almost lost all her senses. He is the best archer in the country. But the boy suddenly looked up and said that she was really wrong in her statement. Nuna looked at him in surprise and asked why he thought that. He put his finger up and said that the best archer was his father. When Nuna heard this, of course, she laughed and said that she meant that he would surely succeed in the future. She herself at this moment thought about the fact that she probably looked like a typical hypocritical maid on the errand of a tyrant. However, they could survive well under Lisa, so she would choose to borrow them. Ask her. So would hold on to this life to the last. And so it had been a few days since then, and she continued to serve her half-brother. One day they were in the library, and she had to bring him books. As soon as he saw her, he immediately inquired if she had brought him what he needed. The girl smiled and said of course, but thought to herself that she'd finally managed to find Kieran's greatest weakness. This weakness was not only books, but also some sweets called macaroons. He most loved eating these cookies, which are colorful with different creams and insanely delicious. When she brought him a whole box of such sweets, he said that she had done a good job. Nuna asked what she would get in return. The guy started eating macaroons one by one, and then asked if she was really going to get greedy, and it was so childish of her. But the girl could already stand up for herself, and told Kieran that if he was so mature and aware, maybe he could share his treat with her instead of eating it all by himself. The boy immediately looked at his candy and pondered for a while. Then he said that since he was an adult, maybe she could have a few pieces. The girl immediately smiled and thanked him for it. Sometimes the children met in the library, hiding behind the shelves from the adults who always forbade them to eat a lot of sweets. And usually their so-called illegal exchange of sweets took place in the afternoon, when parents are most busy with business and do not pay attention to where the children have gone. After a while, when the temperature outside had already dropped a bit, Mother called her children to have tea with them. Raina handed her a box of sweets and asked if she had ever tried macaroons. She explained that it was a new dessert that had been imported from the capital, and it was a very sweet cookie. Nuna, as soon as she saw it, immediately her eyes shone and the woman asked if she liked this kind of cookie. She suddenly laughed and said that Kieran didn't like sweets at all. But now she also had a daughter and it was incredibly nice to be able to treat her to something yummy. So she told her to eat and not to be shy. In fact, at this kind of tea party, the Duchess and Kieran do not even touch the sweets. But the girl, in turn, devours desserts at both cheeks. Nuna thanked the mistress for the sweetness and immediately, without thinking long, took one macaron to taste it. And so, as she took the first bite, she felt the crispy outer layers and the juicy jams of different flavors flowing underneath. The girl was just delighted, and it was an incredibly sweet treat. Then the mother turned to her son and asked if he could have some too. She knew full well that he didn't like that sort of thing. However, she said that Nuna was in history, so perhaps he might like it too. The boy refused at first, but then he agreed to try it, and when his mother saw it, she was very surprised. She asked if he really wanted to try it, because it was very surprising, because he had never agreed to try any new desserts before. When Kieran heard those words, he frowned, and said that he had changed his mind about trying it, also lifting his head up. He added that sweets were for children, and he was quite old. Nuna looked at him, but in truth, she realized that he really wanted to try. However, pride would not allow it. The mother laughed and said that in that case, the girl could finish absolutely all the goodies, for her son was already too old for all that. Nuna straight up glowed with joy and took another cookie, saying that she didn't mind it at all. Kieran watched angrily as she ate her fill of sweets and could only lick his lips, for his pride prevented him from tasting even the smallest bite. After a while, the girl smiled and told her mother that apparently she couldn't eat that much. Raina smiled and said that in that case she could take the box with her and refresh herself later when she wanted to eat. She thanked her for it and immediately took the box with her. She had brought Kieran macaroons a few more times since that tea party, and their relationship seemed to have improved slightly since that incident. And now, as they sat in the library again after their afternoon snack and ate macaroons, Nuna wondered why he kept pretending not to eat sweets if he liked them so much. The guy proudly held his head up and said that macaroons are not sweet at all, and only children eat sweets. Nuna asked in surprise, wondering if that was the case, since she really liked them and didn't consider herself a child. But Kieran said that not at all. She was still a child, and real adults don't eat sweets. The girl wondered if it was just like the Duke and Duchess. His brother replied that it was quite true. He himself did not eat sweets, and neither did his parents. So from the age of 2, he gave up buns and sweets. When Nuna heard this, she wondered and asked him if he had become an adult 4 years ago. He said it was so, and asked her to keep their secret well and not to tell anyone. He handed her the box of leftover candy again, and the girl said she would keep their secret. Kieran then started to walk off towards the exit and said that was fine. He would be very happy if she didn't talk about it amongst everyone else. But then suddenly he stopped next to her rack and asked if she liked chocolates and candy. Nuna smiled and said of course she loved it. Then she understood his plan and said that she would have to tell the Duchess about it, because she had such a sudden desire to eat chocolate. Kieran stepped closer to her and said that of course she could ask for anything, since she was still just a child. The girl agreed with him and said that since she was a child, she would also ask him to buy more candy to eat it all. The guy patted her shoulder and said with a smile that she was a pleasure to deal with. Nuna laughed and thanked him for that and told him to call if he needed anything else. She didn't really need more than that. She hoped that their relationship would remain at least on the level of cooperation and exchange of sweets. The girl sighed heavily and thought about how hard it was to fight for her life, but she had to keep going. Soon afterward, Nuna returned to her room, and there she was met by a little girl who inquired if she was a commoner. She didn't realize who the saucy girl was, but she remembered being told that she was the daughter of Viscount Humphrey, a relative of the Duke. But she sighed heavily and thought about how the kids were terrible now. As soon as the adults and Kieran stepped back, she immediately started to show her temper. She didn't understand. Since the girl had come to play, she should be having fun quietly, not asking such strange questions. The girl was silent for some time. She said, smiling, that she would not even dare to raise her head, for she would have a hard time in society. But Nuna was completely indifferent to this girl and said that she was not really interested in this society. She didn't care about it at all. The girl was outraged and said she was probably ashamed of her background, so she wasn't even considering it. Nuna thought it best to agree with her rather than argue with her yet, so she said she was completely right, and also didn't understand what secular society could even be talked about. She doesn't care about that at all, because her main goal is to become independent before Kieran comes of age. In fact, in the story, the guy just has a terrible temper and usurps his father's place once they find their love, the main character. Then he banishes and Duchess and his named sister is sentenced to death. Now their relationship has certainly improved. However, people are very fickle, so things can change at any moment. Therefore, Nuna's most important priority is to win her brother's favor. However, she should also take care of her independent future and raise the necessary funds for living. She's going to escape from this place as soon as she reaches adulthood. So the girl started walking towards the exit, ignoring her guests completely. Tu got very angry at this behavior, so she started yelling, asking if she could be disrespectful enough to turn her back on her while she was talking. Nuna, at this point, thought about the fact that her girlfriend wasn't affected in any way at all, so she didn't say anything back, just started walking out the door. Well, as soon as she opened it, Kieran appeared in front of her, looking at her intently. The girl was a little surprised, as she hadn't expected to see him so soon, but she smiled and said that he must have come back after all. The girl didn't have time to say another word, but Olivia came running up and told him that she'd been waiting for him for a long time. She also wondered where he was, for she even wanted to go looking for him. The girl gave him a very pitiful look so that he would feel sorry for her. Kieran was silent for a while. Then he smiled and said, "Okay, they could go and play for a while." Olivia was glad of that at once. Then she turned to the girl and told her to stay there, for she did not want to play with her. Nuna didn't react in any way. Her brother turned to her and with a smile told her to wait. Not for long, for he would be back soon. When she looked at him, she couldn't look away. After all, Kieran has an incredibly wonderful smile. But as they turned and walked away, a feeling of inexplicable anxiety and excitement took possession of the girl. She was, as it soon turned out, not without reason. Kieran ended up coming back alone from the walk, and when her parents saw this, the girl's mom was furious. She asked how it was that they could not know where Olivia was now. The woman approached Nuna and told her in a stern voice to quickly tell them what had happened in the first place. After all, she was the oldest, and asked where she had been looking all this time in the first place. The woman shouted at her and asked her to say something, but the girl stood there, very scared. She could not say a word. However, at this point, Kieran stepped forward and said that it wasn't actually her fault. Olivia said herself that she didn't want to play a commoner. When the mother heard this, she was very surprised and had nothing more to say. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and she asked in a sad voice where her dear daughter could go. The guy thought for a moment, then said that Olivia had talked about going to the restroom, and he didn't know where she was now. There was complete silence between the parents. They did not know what to do now. Then the Count replied that they should start searching for the child, because it might be too dangerous. No one knows where she might have gone after the restroom. Olivia's father agreed. Her mother, however, was in agony. She cried and screamed her name all the time. Then the Duke turned to the guards and asked them to search the area around the castle as soon as possible. The guard immediately bowed and said that they would now fulfill everything and try to find the girl as soon as possible. After all this happened, the children were sent upstairs so that they would not disturb the adults. Kieran sat on the couch and with a heavy sigh asked, what else could he do, since it's still a long time before dinner? There were many different sweets in front of them, as well as milkshakes. Without waiting for an answer, he immediately reached for the macaron, which was the most delicious in his opinion. Nuna was silent for a while. Then she moved closer to her brother and asked, does he really not know where Olivia is, since she clearly saw them leave together? The boy started chewing on his cookie and said, humming, that he really didn't know where she might have gone. The girl looked at him in surprise and was beginning to doubt. She wasn't sure if it was true. In fact, she did trust Kira at first, but because she didn't see him as the tyrant he was in the novel. He studied diligently, delving into what she thought was a rather difficult science for a child. And he also endured incredibly hard workouts without showing any resentment to his coaches or parents. In every situation, he did behave in an adult manner and treated the servants very well. However, if it's all contrived and his character really is as described in the novel, then at worst Olivia could be dead. And as soon as Nuna thought about it, she immediately felt uncomfortable. If this tyrant, if he really had a character like the one in the novel, he might have tortured the girl before he died. She was silent for a while. Then, smiling nervously, she said that he'd mentioned earlier that she'd gone to the bathroom. So at least he knew the direction of her steps, and that was something. Kieran looked at her in surprise. He was silent for a while, and then asked why she was so concerned about this girl, since she didn't like Olivia. She was getting on her nerves. When Nuna heard this, she was very surprised. But then she said that she was not surprised at all, that perhaps he was just imagining things, because they were not really like that at all. When the boy heard this, he hesitated, and after that, looking at one point, asked in a quiet voice, "Does she really want to know where this girl is now?" Nuna, when she heard about it, was immediately worried. She clenched her hand into a fist and thought about the fact that she certainly didn't want to become an accessory to murder. But then she gathered her thoughts and said it would be great to finally find her. She wondered if he could help her. The guy finished his cookie and said that was right. The restroom was on the 5th floor. When she heard about it, she was immediately wary and said that the butler's and head maid's rooms were located there. Also, the unused guest room, that restroom is closed at all, and they can't let anyone in there because it doesn't work. But the guy, sighing heavily, said that he had suggested she use the butler's restroom. There was no way Olivia would go to the servant's restroom, however. He took another cookie for himself, and Nuna looked at him and said that really, she wouldn't have gone into it. The boy, smiling, made an understated grin, and said that was why he had warned her not to use the guest foot restroom. Nuna looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. She thought that the only thing worse than a true demon in the flesh was a fallen angel. Soon after, she made her way up to the 5th floor and immediately began to address Olivia, asking if she could hear her. But of course no one responded. Nuna ran down the corridors looking for the girl, and the guy just followed her slowly. She thought about the fact that the castle was too big, and it would just be unrealistic to find her so quickly. Kieran stopped and suggested she'd rather enjoy the chocolate her mother had brought her, and he would share the beautiful candy. When she heard the suggestions, she thought of the way maniacs usually lure children. So she said she didn't want to. She needed to find Olivia now. The guy was very surprised and asked why she needed to do that. Nuna, thinking about it, said that she was just very worried about her, because she was still too young and might get into some trouble. Kieran stopped suddenly and asked if this girl was really that sympathetic to her. She didn't hear his question and simply agreed. In fact, she was more interested in the place she had come to. After all, they had already reached the right restroom. Nuna, not thinking long, immediately ran forward. She opened the door to the room and turned to Olivia, but at that moment she immediately stopped near the door, for she was very surprised to see the fact that the girl was standing over the sink trying to wash her hair. Olivia was crying loudly, and the tips of her hair were all purple. There was some smoke coming out of them, and she just didn't know what to do. Nuna immediately ran up to her, and was also very surprised at this sight. The girl immediately looked at her and asked her to help her. Then, turning to Olivia, she told her to stand still and not move. The sorcery is not working properly in this place, so we'll have to use scissors to correct that situation. When Olivia heard that she was going to have to cut off her hair, she immediately started crying even more, and said there was no way she was going to agree to that. But Nuna was not willing to listen to anything. She began to look around and asked if she could wait a bit. She's going to look for something to cut her hair off with now. Then she walked forward and saw a letter opener on the nightstand nearby. So she ran right over to it to help Olivia. But just as she was about to approach the girl, she heard a loud scream from her. She even collapsed to the ground. Nuna immediately turned in her direction and saw the girl lying on the floor. Kieran was standing next to her with her long hair in his hands, and Olivia was crying, pitying her beautiful braids. The girl just stood there looking at the whole thing, thinking that her brother was just crazy. The boy, for his part, continued to stand still and hold the girl's hair as if it were the head of his victim. Then he slowly turned in her direction, and with a smile told Nuna that he had saved her pet Olivia. She was perfectly fine now. The girl herself continued to cry and scream loudly. She felt sorry for her hair because she loved it so much. Nuna tried to calm down a little. She thanked Kieran for his help and decided not to say anything more, for she was afraid of making him angry. Shortly afterward, they went downstairs and gave their daughter to her parents. Olivia's father looked at Kieran and said he had no idea how grateful he was. They sat around the large dining room table and had dinner. The man also thanked him and said that it was incredibly great that he had found their beloved daughter after all. But the boy pulled back a little and said that they should thank Nuna for that. He in turn only pulled her hair out of the sink. Olivia, who had already calmed down a bit and had short hair, said that this Korean was a villain. He ruined her beautiful hair and just brutally cut off her beautiful golden-colored braids. Nuna looked at her and thought to herself that he had definitely overdone it with the length. He could have left a little more hair there. Well, the father, hearing his daughter's indignation, asked what she was saying, for everything suited her. Mother laughed and agreed with him and said it was a given, and wondered where Kieran got such a fine hairdressing talent. Nuna continued to eat her dinner and thought about how he was being praised over any nonsense, and she was sure he had planned the whole thing himself in the first place. And now he was sitting perfectly still and cutting his steaks according to all the rules of etiquette with his little hands. It really annoyed her, and she thought about the fact that it didn't look like he had any remorse for what he'd done. Then suddenly the mother spoke up and said that she was incredibly proud of their Nuna, and the children immediately took notice of her. And in turn, Reina also said that she found Olivia very quickly, and she doesn't even know what they would have done if the girl wasn't around. Her father agreed with her and raised his glass up, saying they should thank her properly. When Olivia's father and mother heard this, they were a little uncomfortable, for the girl was a commoner. But the man raised his glass up and told her thank you for what she had done. Nuna smiled in public, but realized herself that they were of course insincerely grateful. Then she said that it wasn't worth it, because she had done what she had to do, and anyone would have done it in her place. Suddenly Olivia's mother clapped her hands and began to shout, saying that she was very forgetful. They had presents for the children. She carried the things into the room and said that Kieran would have toys from the best craftsmen in the capital. They're monster figurines. He can look. There's a huge raven and even a dragon. The boy was a little embarrassed but thanked her for it. Nuna, who was watching his reaction from the side, immediately realized that he was not very happy about it, because toys are for babies. Then she also took out a gold coin and said that it was also a small reward for him helping their Olivia. When the girl saw it, she was very surprised. She did not expect that this woman could give money. Reina then walked over to Olivia and handed over her small gift, as well as some money. The girl immediately thanked her for it. Nuna thought at that moment that since Kieran and Olivia had gotten their gifts, maybe she would get something. So she stood waiting. At that moment her mother came up to her, and putting her hand on her shoulder, told her guest that she was probably ready to receive her gift too. But Olivia's father suddenly looked away and said that somehow they hadn't thought of that, and that's why they hadn't prepared anything for the little girl. Nuna realized that they hadn't bought her anything on purpose, since she was a commoner. But she had enough of the smallest of things, money, so she was not going to be discouraged just yet. She laughed nervously, smiled, and said that her pocket money would be enough for her. However, the man came closer to her and said that she was too much of an impudent girl. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was calling her that. Suddenly the game intervened in the conversation. He turned to the Viscountess and asked her what he had just said about Nuna. Reina also intervened in the conversation and said that she didn't realize that their financial situation was so dire that they couldn't even reward a child. She's sorry. And the Duke added that he had heard that things were bad, but he didn't think it would be this bad. The Viscountess took them by surprise. Then the girl turned to her daughter and told her not to be upset, for she would give her some coins instead of those uncles. Then her father handed her some coins, saying that this toy would also be special for her. He hoped she liked it. Her new doll and jewelry were made of real gems. Nuna, seeing it, was very surprised, and Mother also added that this doll was made by a craftsman whose work the Humphreys could not even afford. She hesitated at this point, not knowing if they were being too generous by giving her such an expensive doll. Kieran, who was standing nearby, suddenly frowned. The girl thought at that moment that he must be displeased that she had received such an expensive gift. The boy did look angry, but then he turned his gaze to Olivia's parents, and they were a little frightened, for he did look stern. Nuna followed his gaze and couldn't understand why he was staring so viciously at the Viscounts and didn't even look away. She realized that he had nothing good to say to them when he looked at them like that. Eventually, as night fell, the girl woke up and went to her brother's bedroom. She knocked on his room and, turning to Kieran, asked if he would sleep with her one night. The girl's tears even flowed. In fact, she gets scared at night and finally decided to follow him this night. She wanted to make sure he wouldn't kill anyone. She also tried to improve their relationship, but still keep a reasonable distance between them. All her plans for the future crumble before her eyes because of this horrible nightmare and fear. Then suddenly the boy with sleepy eyes looked at his sister and asked why she had suddenly come. Nuna smiled and said that she was just a little scared to sleep alone, so she'd like him to stick around for a little while at least. Kieran took her hand at that moment and led her into the room, saying that she was a coward. They both laughed and the girl confirmed it. When they got on the bed, he let her lie down next to him. The boy closed his eyes and said goodnight to her. Nuna hugged his arm and also said goodnight. In fact, she did it on purpose so that he wouldn't get out. And in the middle of the night, her eyes suddenly began to close. Apparently, it had been a very long day, and she realized she was falling asleep. But at that moment, she was approached by her brother, who turned and looked her straight in the eye. He asked in a whisper why she liked Olivia so much. Nuna immediately perked up when she heard the question. She felt a little uncomfortable, and she didn't know what to say to him. Then, coughing, she asked if he really wanted to know. The boy waved his head in agreement. The girl was silent for a while longer, and then she said that Olivia was pretty even, so somehow that was that. She herself noticed at this point that he was purposely making a very cute face to confuse her, but she was already used to his smarmy expression, so it wouldn't work. He shouldn't underestimate the grad student's skills. Her insight is top-notch. Kieran sat on the bed then and wondered why she thought that, since Olivia had been disgusting all this time. Nuna also sat down and said that it was not for nothing that they say that beautiful people are forgiven a lot of things, so it must be something like that. The boy in turn frowned and asked what about him. The girl realized that this was just the right moment to compliment him, so she smiled and said that he was awesome himself. In fact, she was even more tempted at that moment to go tell her cheeks and tell him he was very cute, just like the first day they'd met. But she was able to restrain herself after all. It hadn't gone well that time, so there was no way she should mess things up now. Kieran looked into her eyes and asked if she thought he was cute too. The girl, when she heard this, immediately began to protest and replied that she had never thought so. Then he lay back on the bed and, closing his eyes, said that he understood everything now. Nuna continued to sit for a while, thinking that the interrogation was probably over, that she could exhale. As soon as she lay on her back, the boy put his arm around her and wished her sweet dreams. When she saw this, she thought it was an incredibly sweet gesture on his part, but she was able to contain her emotions and wished him sweet dreams as well. At that moment, she thought that this is probably about how cat owners feel when their fluffies come to them at night to sleep next to them. At times, his good looks confuse her, and she even forgets what kind of man he will become in the future. But that's okay when Olivia leaves. She believes their relationship will be the same. Kieran suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and looked at his sister and was very indignant. He thought it was as if she had forgotten who she was supposed to be serving, saying that Olivia was nice and even defending her. He had taught this Olivia a lesson for bullying her, and Nuna had looked at him as if he had done something completely wrong, and he didn't understand where they only came from to be so ungrateful. On the day they first met, the girl had told her he was very handsome. Now she claims the exact opposite. Of course, the boy doesn't like to be called cute all the time. But Nuna's words to the contrary made him feel uncomfortable for some reason. Though it didn't matter at all. After all, she was and still is his only and unchanging servant. He took the girl's hand and said goodnight to her again, thinking of something good. The next morning, her brother and sister were sitting in the library studying books, and Olivia, who had just recently woken up, came in. She had a toy in her hands and walked over to Nuna. The girl looked up immediately and, seeing Olivia in front of her, asked in surprise what she wanted. She asked in a shaky voice if she needed to use the restroom. Nuna pretended not to understand her innuendo and turned back to the book, saying that she didn't feel like it just yet somehow. Olivia was trembling because she needed to go to the restroom very badly, and she came closer and asked if she was sure she didn't need to go. The girl realized at that moment that she was going to pee because of her fear, so she had no choice but to agree. She immediately took Nuna's hand and led her to the restroom, telling her to hurry. After what happened, all three of them went to play in the game room. Olivia was a beautiful princess, and she appealed to the prince, asking him to save her from the monster. As the prince in this Nuna game, she had a wooden sword and also sat on a toy horse and turned to the monster and told him to be afraid of her. Olivia screamed, telling him to help their kingdom, and she would definitely marry him. Kieran stood between the two girls, playing the monster. Olivia looked at her prince passenger and wondered if he would take her as his wife. Nuna's brother looked at her in surprise. He stood in his maid's beret, which was what was known as an evil dragon crest, and asked his sister what was even going on. The girl herself didn't know how to explain it all to him, since Olivia held her hand even when she was just sitting on the toilet. She also asked her to wash her hands because she is now afraid of the sink. She also had to kill a little spider because of Olivia's fear, so now she thinks the girl is Prince Charming who saves her princess. They continued to play their parts, and then Kieran suddenly couldn't take it anymore. He turned toward his sister and asked if she was really going to marry Olivia. Nuna looked at him in surprise, while she herself didn't understand why he was angry about playing a minor role while they became the main characters. But then, suddenly the boy went on and said that she had said he was much better than Olivia. She scratched the back of her head and said that of course he was. Kieran turned around and said that in that case, she should not marry Olivia, but him. At that moment, he even held out his hand to the girl. Nuna was hurt right in the heart by his charm. We thought about how incredibly sweet it was of him. But then, all of a sudden, Olivia started to get indignant and said that it wouldn't work that way because the girl was marrying her. The boy turned in her direction and indignantly asked if she could buy her more presents than he could in general. Because marriage is a time when people live together and enjoy each other's gifts all the time. Nuna just sat and watched them argue. She didn't want to get involved. At that moment, she thought that it was not surprising that the boy had such an impression of the marriage, for in the ducal family, gifts were given quite often and even usually without occasion. And she thinks that's why he thinks matrimony is only about gifts, so the girl laughed and already wanted to agree with him. But at that moment, Mother Reina suddenly came in and turned to her son and asked him what he was even talking about. Her voice was very stern, and Kieran immediately turned in her direction, and when he saw his mother, he was very surprised. She, in turn, was very worried. The woman smiled nervously and said that relatives couldn't marry each other, and no matter how much he liked Nuna, he couldn't marry her. When the boy heard such a thing, he became very indignant and asked who had thought of such a thing in the first place. Nuna was very nervous at this point. Of course, games are games. However, a successful marriage is very important to the nobility, so it is necessary to explain everything to him at once, so that there would be no more such questions. Reina was suddenly very angry. She wanted to yell at her son, but then she apologized and said that she hadn't noticed how she had given in to all these emotions. She took him in her arms and said that apparently they just needed to talk about something. So turning to the girls, she told them to play nicely, and she would take Kieran to her place for now. With those words, the Duchess took him away, and for quite a while they were gone. And then a few days later, when Olivia's family left, he finally showed up. But it happened in a rather unusual way. When Nuna was getting ready for bed, the boy suddenly climbed through her window and asked if she was awake. Nuna was very surprised, but came closer to him and told him that she was awake, and asked if he was okay and where he had even been. Kieran shrugged his feet off the dirt and said he was with his mom, but it didn't matter at all. At this point, he started to reach for something from behind his back. Then he handed the girl a jar and told her to take it. When she looked at it, she saw many different candies and lollipops, and said that it was his precious piggy bank of sweets that he trusted to no one. Then she looked at her brother and asked him why he had suddenly decided to give it to her. Kieran was very worried and said that it was the most precious thing he had, and he was giving it to her, his fiancée. Nuna, when she heard about it, was very surprised. She did not answer him anything, and she herself did not understand how it is so, and makes a proposal to the main character of the novel. And he had hated her the very first time. But the girl didn't understand when they had ever managed to get so close. Nuna suddenly laughed, and looking at her brother asked, "Is this really a marriage proposal?" But she doesn't understand how this is possible. After all, they are brother and sister. And as Mother said, relatives cannot become husband and wife. However, Kieran was indignant and said that he didn't care about this rule at all. He looked confidently at the girl and said that he would marry her, and it was completely out of the question. Nuna blushed with embarrassment. She was silent for a while, and then she said that she agreed and that they would marry. He stood still for a while, and then he came over and hugged the girl. She laughed and asked him if he was really that happy. She laughed and asked him if he was that happy, but she thought that he was incredibly sweet and much better than the novel described. In fact, it's because of how cute he is that this kid will meet the main character of the novel and fall in love with her for real. However, she was still very pleased because of the fact that he is willing to marry her, even when he hates her. Nuna thought about how he was so cute that she would even bite him. But she got so caught up in the thought that she didn't even notice when she actually did it. The guy didn't pay much attention to any of this. He just rubbed the bite and said that she would have to run away from home with him. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised, not knowing what he was talking about. But in fact, at the same time their parents were lying in the bedroom. The father turned to his wife, asking if she thought a week's punishment was too much. Raina replied that their Viscount had lost all his hair. However, they made no complaints. Still, because of the prank, she spent too much magical power to create wigs. Besides, Kieran clearly lacks upbringing, so she didn't think it was overkill. The man turned on his other side and said with a heavy sigh that if she really felt that way, he wouldn't argue with her. Soon after, however, the butler knocked and, addressing His Majesty, said that Mr. Syrian had knocked out the guards and escaped. When his parents heard this, they were indignant and thought that he was an unruly boy. In fact, as late as last night, Nuna had to listen to different stories from Kieran, who was talking about how they needed to leave immediately. If she wanted to marry him, she had to go with him, and the full meaning of his words she could not realize until a week later. They rode in the wagons, and her mother complimented the girl's dress, which was very fine indeed. Nuna thanked her and said it was all just because of her sense of style. Otherwise, it would have been very ugly. Raina giggled and said that she was sure she'd have no shortage of suitors at the festival because of such cuteness. Kieran moved closer to her and said in her ear that he had heard that this was a very dangerous event. So he suggested that she run away as soon as possible to avoid even getting to it. Nuna, hearing this, didn't understand why he kept talking about running away. She was only going to go for it when she could save up enough money. Therefore, she turned to him and said that he was a descendant of the Ister family after all, and there was no way to go to the country's foundation festival without a protagonist. In fact, when reading the novel, the girl did not yet know that the founder of this country was said to be the first Duke of Istir, except that as time went on, he got very bored with the affairs of state, so he turned it all over to the local chancellor, saying that he would now be king. In fact, the girl wasn't surprised at all that he was Kirill's relative. But then suddenly the father spoke up and told his son that this festival was a rather important and special event. And all because their Nuna Istera is finally stepping out into the socialite society. So it is mandatory to behave well at the event and follow all the etiquette norms. Some more time passed, and they finally arrived at the event. The butler introduced them, and when they came out through the balcony, the people immediately began to applaud and worship the dukes. However, there were some people who were not so happy. Nuna noticed many reproachful looks, and they were all directed specifically at her, a supposed lady outsider from the common people who did not fit in with their family. These people didn't even try to hide their contempt, and it seemed to her that they were ready to express their displeasure to the child's face. Reina took her daughter's hand and told her that her mother was there for her, so she shouldn't worry. Nuna looked at her and was ready to cry, for she had never had so much attention, and it made her feel good. Well, at that moment, a young lady approached them. The woman addressed her, said that they had not seen the Viscountess for a long time, and also inquired whether she already knew her daughter. The Duchess approached many noble ladies and kept talking about how Nuna was now her daughter. In fact, because of how fast and much it was all happening, the girl didn't even have time to worry. Suddenly one of the women turned to them and asked the Countess, "Is she at this event without her son? She remembers that she and Nuna are related." However, at that moment, Kieran jumped on the girl's shoulders and covered her mouth with his hand. When the Countess sensed this, she got very angry and said that they had their own female company. So she suggested that he move back to his father so that he wouldn't be embarrassed by all this talk. For some time the Countess fought with her son, who would not get off her. She was very annoyed, but she could do nothing about it. But at that moment some woman approached them. She greeted the Duchess, who was still trying to get her son away from her. It was the Marquise of Marginini, and the woman bowed and said that she could see that their family was still as friendly as ever. Then she shifted her gaze to the girl standing next to her and asked, "Is that really their adopted daughter now?" Nuna looked at the stranger with her beautiful big eyes and said hello to her. The Marquise in turn smiled and said that she was a very interesting young lady. In fact, there was a slyness in her gaze. She then shifted her gaze to the little boy, who had already calmed down a bit, and said that she hoped he was doing pretty well too. Kieran said he was doing well. Then he asked if he remembered correctly that she only had a daughter. The woman laughed, as if he'd said some fine joke, and said he was correct. Then she said that if it was already about that, the little girl had just come along with her. At that moment, a little toddler came up and bowed. Viscountessa asked that everyone get to know each other, for this was her daughter Esmeralda. She had beautiful dark hair, lovely violet eyes, and gorgeous facial features. The girl bowed, looked up and said her name in greeting. Nuna, as soon as she looked at her, immediately realized that this was the protagonist of this novel. She felt a little uneasy, her whole body trembling, but she was glad that they could finally meet. The girl also thought that she just had to be friends with Esmeralda. After all, in the original story, her heroine bullied her in every possible way and was eventually killed by her brother. However, Nuna is not going to repeat the same old stories and she wants to save herself. So she needs to make sure to get close to this little girl. Viscountessa kept smiling and said that apparently their daughters are the same age and it would be great if they became friends and had a good relationship. Nuna, when she heard this, was immediately excited. She thought that this would be her chance. Suddenly, her mother turned to her and asked if she would like to play with Esmeralda. The girl didn't hold back and said she would love to go and play with her. Reina looked at Esmeralda and wondered if she would even be willing to do this. She agreed, of course, and then the two of them began to walk away. However, Nuna stopped, remembering that they still needed to bring Kieran with them. So she turned and asked if he was coming. The boy was a little surprised, but then he said that he wasn't going, but that he was going to look after his mom. But then he realized that this sounded too strange, so he corrected himself by saying that he would just stay with his mother for a while. Nuna was surprised to hear that. She didn't really think they were interested in each other at all, but maybe that was because the main plot hadn't started yet, and they were too young to think of each other that way. They retired to a separate room, where they sat down at a small table to hold a tea party, and the girl realized that Esmeralda was indeed very much like the main character of the novel. They were silent for a while. And then Esmeralda said that if the girl didn't mind, she would ask that Nuna address her simply as Esmerald. She said the title sounds too formal and dry. That's why she didn't like it. Nuna agreed, of course, but she realized that it didn't fit with the original story anyway. And all because in the novel, she was the daughter of poor barons, but was popular because of her zany disposition. In fact, she now sees before her the humble daughter of the wealthy marquis, as if someone had remade the entire character's settings to look completely different. Esmeralda, a little embarrassed, told her new acquaintance that it was the first time they had seen each other. However, she was eager to be friends with her. Nuna straight up fawned over this girl's cuteness and charm, and said that she, too, would be incredibly happy if they became friends. Well, be that as it may, the girl's main task now was to get close to Esmeralda, and she, in turn, knew all her hobbies. So Nuna turned to the lady and asked how she felt about fencing, riding, and even archery. Esmeralda, when she heard all this, was very surprised. But then she put her head down and said that she practiced hard every day, but she was still pretty bad at it. When the girl heard about it, she was even confused by her unexpected reaction. She thought she was very good at it, and that she loved it. Then she decided to calm Esmeralda down a bit and told her it was just a hobby. The main thing was to enjoy the process, and the result would come at the end. In fact, according to the story, the main characters came together precisely because of similar interests and skills. Their beautiful couple seemed to have been made in heaven, and it was strange to her now that Esmeralda was responding that way. But she supposed she probably just needed to learn and everything would be fine. Nuna was silent for a while, wondering what she should do. After that, she wondered if she might like sweets. She thought about the fact that absolutely all children love sweets, and when Esmeralda heard about it, her eyes immediately shone, and she said that she was madly fond of various cakes and pastries. Nuna was immediately pleased, thinking that they would have a common topic of conversation, and at least one thing to do with Kieran. And the girl suddenly said in a voice trembling with sadness that she could not have them. When Nuna heard this, she immediately asked why. Esmeralda, in turn, explained that it was to preserve her beauty, and that she must not get fat. When the girl heard this, she was incredibly surprised and couldn't understand what she was saying. She was still very young to be thinking about all this. But Esmeralda was already all shivering. She was uncomfortable with this conversation, and she said that she must be sure to take care of her figure, as her mother said. Esmeralda was so upset that she even accidentally dropped her teacup from her hands. She immediately touched her head, which became dizzy. Nuna jumped in surprise. She moved closer to her, but the girl told her not to worry because everything was fine. Nuna, when she heard this, asked in surprise how she could not be worried. But Esmeralda said in a calm voice that she just had occasional headaches, so there was no need to worry, and she suggested that they just continue talking. As if out of the blue, Esmeralda said that she knew of a great bait shop there that sold very tasty desserts. Of course, she couldn't eat them, but she would be sure to treat her the next time they met. Nuna realized that it was best to stay out of her situation and said that she wouldn't mind even that. She then turned to Esmeralda and asked her to wait for her at this place, and she would bring her some warm soup and some snacks for her to build up her strength. The girl realized that something was definitely wrong, for Esmeralda was too different from the frisky heroine described in the novel. She went at once to the kitchen to get some food for the girl. Nuna knew that this girl was definitely Esmeralda. After all, she doesn't know what the heroine herself was like before the story began. She started to put food on for Esmeralda, and thought about the fact that her bloodline had changed too. It was probably worth getting to know her better. And for that, they needed to get closer. But at that moment, someone came up behind her and shoved her straight in the back. Nuna couldn't help herself, and everything she had on the tray fell to the ground. She tried her best to keep her balance, because she realized that she must not fall, because she would never be able to pay for this ruined outfit, even if she had to work as a maid for the rest of her life. She thought about the fact that even if she scrubbed the palace floors for a year, she could only cover the cost of one small pebble for shoes. So Nuna tried to spin around and steady her feet so she wouldn't fall into the dirty plates. But the stranger pushed her so hard that it was impossible not to fall. The girl hit the ground very hard with her body, but she did not hit the soup that spilled on the floor, and she thought that at least she was alive, and that was already good. 3 girls came up to her, one of them shoving her. She looked up arrogantly and asked Nuna if she had just pushed her. The girl looked at her in surprise and didn't understand what was even going on. It was a gang of tough girls who were always making fun of everyone, and she thought it was downright very stupid cliché and a hero in the story. She continued to sit for a while, but suddenly she saw that all the guests were looking at her and whispering. They were wondering what was going on and why the children had started this argument. Nuna was madly upset, for she had tried her best not to attract the attention of others, and she was very annoyed that because of these 3 little girls, she had failed to do so. Then the main offender spoke up and said that she understood perfectly well that people are not taught etiquette. However, she did not even apologize for her rudeness. When her girlfriend spoke up and said that, by the way, because of Nuna, Lady Lemira had soiled her beautiful and expensive dress. Another friend looked at her with a heavy sigh and asked if she would at least take responsibility for her actions. Nuna sighed heavily and thought about the fact that she owed it to him to teach him a lesson. So the girl got to her feet and wondered if they really wanted her to apologize for the stain on her dress. Then she said, with her head down, that she was glad she knew how to solve her problems at all. For these shoes had been made especially for this evening, and they now had a huge soup stain on them. So she demands that Lady Lemira take responsibility, for it was she who pushed her. The girl had not expected her to stand up for herself and could not even answer her. But Nuna insisted and said that it was exactly her misconduct, so she should be punished and also apologize sincerely. Lady Lemira was about to object and say that she had done it all, but Nuna interrupted her and said that it was incredibly nice that she had admitted her mistake and apologized, so she thanked her for that. When the girl heard all this, she got more than a little angry and said that it was all some nonsense and asked her to stop making things up finally. Nuna pretended not to hear her at all and asked if she was really willing to cover all the damage, and it was incredibly generous of her to do so. The girl tried to object and said that she didn't mean it at all, and it was Nuna who pushed her in the first place, and she should be the one making amends. She shouted so loudly that all the people immediately paid attention to them. They didn't understand how such a young lady could make such a noise at a social event with so many noble guests. People began to turn around and whisper, asking if it was Lady Lemira by chance, and in their time such behavior was simply unacceptable, and they were severely punished for this kind of disrespect to people. When the girl heard all this, she didn't even hold back and shed a few tears. Nuna saw this and was very surprised. She didn't expect that the girl would even get so upset. She felt a little uncomfortable and thought about how she probably should have gone gently. She was still a child after all. But then decided that she had laughed a little, and we could call this whole circus to a close. Nuna turned around and told her to find her when she was ready to make amends, and she would be on her way. After all, she had a few other things to do. Lady Lemira immediately came closer to her and asked her where she had run to, and asked her to stop right away. They had not finished talking yet, but she was so angry and inattentive that she didn't even notice how she slipped on that puddle of soup and fell face first into it. Nuna was very surprised when she saw this, and immediately came closer to her, asking if she was all right at all. But the girl failed to calculate her capabilities, and also hooked herself over a small step that was nearby. She began to fly headlong downward, thinking that she was going to fall, and that she was going to have sleepless nights of maid work ahead of her. After a while, however, nothing happened. She opened her eyes and saw that she was suddenly being held down by a young guy with brightly colored hair. He asked if she was all right. Nuna was incredibly surprised, but when she looked at his beautiful appearance, she couldn't believe her happiness, and thought that it was some prince appearing in front of her. But then suddenly the boy looked at her in surprise and asked her what she was saying. Then the girl immediately realized that she had accidentally said it out loud, and she felt very embarrassed, so she shakily thanked him for saving her. At that moment, the mother of the abuser suddenly ran up to them and asked what was going on. Lady Livia immediately pointed a finger in her direction, and the woman asked who dared to mock her daughter like that. Nuna started to get very worried and didn't understand why she didn't want to sort things out on her own. She immediately went to snitch to her mother, and this brought even more attention to their situation than she had expected. When the woman came closer to her and kept yelling, asked her what the hell is she even allowing herself, she has no upbringing, then Nuna didn't know what to do. After all, the appearance of the adults had only exacerbated the situation. The boy who was standing next to her turned to Countess Lemira and asked her to let her explain everything. However, Nuna stepped forward and said that she didn't intend to put up with any more of this. She sighed heavily and said that they were incredibly hard to deal with and could even piss off a graduate student. When the woman heard this, she was very surprised and asked what she was talking about, because she didn't even know the word. Nuna stepped forward and offered to set the record straight. As she had said, It was her daughter who had caused this whole farce by pushing her, and it was her fault that she had knocked over a whole plate of food. She was very angry, and said that it was because of her daughter that her dragon skin shoes, made especially for this event by special order of the Duchess, also got dirty. They are incredibly expensive and rare in their empire. The Duchess, when she heard this, was very much surprised. She asked if these shoes had been made to her mother's very order. Nuna sighed heavily and said that perhaps their family had never even heard of such a thing, because this leather only softens after 100 years of tanning. However, they certainly don't have the brains to have that kind of information. But she also added that she doesn't blame them, of course. Ordinary people rarely get a chance to even get a glimpse of that skin. When they first came to the store, the sales clerk was very surprised when she heard about it. She asked if the lady really wanted shoes made of the very hide that was almost impossible to obtain, and then had to be tanned for a century. Well, the Duchess told her not to worry, because her husband could do the machining in a day, and all they had to do was design. Certainly, Nuna had lied a bit in her story, and one can see it took less than 100 years to make the shoes. However, still, this leather is very expensive. Nuna also said that they would need a substantial amount of money to compensate for the damage. In fact, the dragon's skin is so tough that even the sharpest knife cannot cut it off. So it was certainly impossible to spoil her with some ordinary soup. But Nuna still insisted, and told the lady that they would send the check to them at the palace and expect payment. The woman was furious and asked if they could at least prove that it was her daughter. The girl was a little worried, not understanding what else they could get to. Then the guy who had already helped Nuna from falling spoke up and said that he could testify. He is the prince of the kingdom of Shia, and confirms the words of the girl. Nuna looked at him in surprise. She couldn't believe he was really a prince. The guy said that her daughter had really pushed that lady and she had gotten her shoes dirty because of her. She herself at this moment thought of the Shia kingdom as a friendly country and an incredibly strong state. It was even mentioned in the novel more than once. The guy looked at the mistress, who was still resisting, and asked if she and he would not believe him now. The woman had nothing else to do. She did not know what to do now. Then she turned to her daughter and started yelling at her already, asking her when she would learn to think before she did something. She also asked that the girl apologize to the lady right away. Her daughter had already started to resist, saying that it was not fair. However, the lady turned to Nuna and apologized for her, saying that her daughter must have made a mistake. Nuna, for her part, was still very surprised, for the prince had said only a few words, and the conflict seemed to evaporate immediately. She thanked him in a trembling voice for his help. She herself could not believe that in aristocratic society, as always, status decides. But at that moment, someone else came up to them and called out to the girl. Nuna immediately turned and saw that it was Lady Esmeralda. The girl looked worried and asked if she was all right, and wondered what had happened since she had been gone for a long time. Nuna took her hands in hers and told her that everything was resolved and pretty well, and asked her how she was feeling. The girl replied that she was feeling better, but that she thought she should find her. And so, thanks to the help of a suddenly appearing prince, the situation was completely resolved. Esmeralda turned to her new friend and said that it was their turn to dance and wondered if she could handle it. Nuna replied that she was absolutely fine, so they should get going as soon as possible. Esmeralda's mother was at this moment watching everything carefully. Nuna thought everything was fine, but it was not. Just as the girls were about to step aside, a prince suddenly approached them and asked the lady if she would be his wife. At this very time, Kieran continued to stand next to his mother and was incredibly angry with her. Reina tried to remain calm and asked Kieran to let her sister befriend the other guys as well. After all, she had the right to do so. But the boy was incredibly angry and said he would never allow it. The mother smiled, but she was incredibly angry, thinking that they couldn't ruin Nuna's first outing, could they? Before everything that was going on, Esmeralda had suggested that she go dancing together, because it might cheer them both up. Nuna wouldn't have minded. However, poor Esmeralda was dragged away by a whole crowd of boys who wanted most of all to dance with her. And the girl who was left out thought about how she was just being a clumsy potato in front of Esmeralda. But she thought that even as a vegetable she looked pretty good. However, that doesn't change the situation. Then this very prince approached her and, holding out his hand, offered to dance with her. He, smiling, said that he is the first prince of the Xia kingdom. He is hers. When the girl heard that name, she immediately remembered that he had been mentioned several times in the novel. Nuna, when she saw that he was expecting something, immediately bowed and introduced herself to him, and again thanked him for his help. Then they began to dance together. At this moment, the girl thought that this guy was the very first suitor of the main character, Esmeralda. But at that moment, the prince took her hand and kissed it as a sign of greeting and politeness. Nuna immediately removed her hand after he finished. She was blushing because of these terrible rules of etiquette. Then the boy smiled and asked if she accepted his invitation to dance. The girl, of course, agreed, but said that she was a pretty bad dancer. Hers replied, smiling, that it wasn't a big deal, because they were still children. After that, they started dancing, and they were both very awkward. When he saw her frightened face, he told Nuna not to worry, because he would lead, and she would just have to follow him. After a few minutes of dancing, the girl apologized to him and told him that he was probably very disappointed in her, and that he should find another dance partner. But hers, smiling, said not at all. He wanted to dance with her, for he liked her very much. Nuna was very surprised when she heard this, and thought that such speeches usually broke girls' hearts. But suddenly the boy smiled even wider and said that he knew her secret. When she heard this, she was very surprised and could not believe that he really knew the whole truth. Hers, for his part, said he was unfamiliar with such things. However, in their family, dragon skin vests are inherited. They are called impenetrable protection. Such a vest protects from both summer rain and hail of arrows. With this kind of armor, you can attack even the most fearsome beasts, because it can protect you from animal fangs. And of course, it is not afraid of any creepy, sticky soup. He looked down at her beautiful shoes and said that surely her shoes would also be okay, since they were made of the same leather. Nuna was immediately embarrassed when she heard this. Then she calmed down a little, for she was thinking of another secret. But she waved her hand and said that he had caught her. Hers laughed and said she had an impressive performance and was incredibly well able to play her part. They continued to dance, and the girl said she was a little amazed that he even liked her lying to a noblewoman. But the boy replied that, if admittedly, it was the first time he had ever seen a girl of his age who could lie so skillfully and even stand up for herself. They were silent for a while, and then he said that he had been wondering for quite some time. He gathered his wits, and then, looking her straight in the eye, asked if she would be his wife. Nuna was very surprised to hear this. She couldn't believe that she had received 2 offers in the last few days. She couldn't even dream of such a thing in her previous life, let alone choose between them. They stopped at once, and the girl, taking her hand from his, said that his suddenness confused her a little. He let go of her hand and said he didn't actually have a real wedding in mind. He smiled and said that they were too young after all, so he would like to propose to her a prenuptial agreement. When the girl heard this, she sighed heavily and thought about the fact that it was all because of this stupid affair. It's always not like people here. Then he asked her if she remembered that he was the first prince. Nuna looked at him in surprise and asked if he was not the heir. The boy only smiled and said that apparently he was indeed the right choice. In fact, to make a long story short, hers said that because his mother, the former empress, was deposed, the order of succession in their country became unclear, and now his rival for the throne is the second prince, the son of the current empress. Hers is in a precarious position at the moment, so he wants to strengthen his reputation by linking up with the Duchy of Ister. He also said that he was ready on his part to sponsor any of her activities in the Society of Notables. And he also knew that Esther's family rarely appears in high society, so their social standing is ambiguous. He thought their engagement would help in this matter, so he looked at her and asked her what she thought about it at all. Nuna smiled, but she didn't know what to say. Then he said that perhaps she had some conditions and offers, and that he was ready to give in if necessary. The girl thought for a while, and then said something about money. She explained that her condition would be that she wished to receive a certain amount of money into her personal account each month. Nuna understood that in order to leave the duchy, means were needed, and gold or jewelry was of no use to a commoner. It would only attract attention. But when hers heard this, he could not contain his laughter. He laughed for a while longer. The girl watched in surprise and thought that of course she had no doubt that it would not work out. But suddenly, to her surprise, the boy coughed and said that he had agreed to her terms. When Nuna heard this, she asked in surprise if it was true. He said that he had expected her to want something more onerous, but since it was just money, it was nothing to him. She was very worried, but she thought about the fact that she had managed to pull it off. But now, for some reason, she felt a twinge of conscience. So the girl decided to say that maybe he didn't know yet, but she wasn't exactly a true Eyster. In fact, she's probably not even capable of helping him in any way. However, the guy interrupted her and said that he was sure they would make perfect partners. He held out his hand and said he thought he should ask again. Then, turning formally to the girl, he asked if she would become his wife. Nuna put her hand in his, thinking that there was no way she should miss such a chance. So she said that she agreed to his proposal. However, at that moment behind her she heard someone approach and address her. The voice was very familiar. As soon as the girl turned back around, she saw Kieran, who was incredibly angry. The girl was well aware that this was going to be a problem. In fact, when hers talked about the engagement, she too remembered her brother's proposal, though in jest. However, she had made him a true promise, and Nuna decided not to tell him that she was marrying someone else, because she was afraid that when he heard the news, he would hate her again and abuse her very much. Kieran looked at the girl with a pitying look, and tears began to come to his eyes. Then, turning to her, he asked if she was really going to marry him. In fact, she hadn't expected this kind of reaction from him at all, much less that he would be so upset that he would even cry. Kieran, without even waiting for an answer from her, turned around and started to walk away. Nuna felt guilty and immediately ran after him. The prince, with whom she had been standing all this time, also followed her, asking where she was going. But the girl, turning to hers, suggested that they discuss all this some other time. So she immediately ran after her brother, who had gone out on the veranda to get some fresh evening air. Hearing that she had gotten close enough, Kieran said that she had talked about marrying him. Hadn't she? She had promised him. Nuna said that was right, and also added that it was not a wedding, but only an engagement, and she had her own reasons. So he had no right to judge her. No doubt it all sounds like a silly excuse to him. However, she must not miss out on such a wonderful opportunity. She must become financially independent in order to leave in peace. Mentally, the girl apologized to him. Kieran began to wipe his tears with his hand and asked what was the difference between an engagement and a wedding. Nuna was a little worried. She said that the engagement was just an announcement of the wedding and could be broken off at any time. She didn't know how to explain the whole situation to him, but it was very important for her to agree to the proposal at the moment. But then suddenly the boy turned and looked at her with an angry look and asked if she was lying this time, for apparently the promise meant absolutely nothing to her. Nuna put her hand on her heart and said that there is absolutely no lie this time. She says everything sincerely and honestly. Kieran couldn't stand it at that moment. He ran to her and started hugging the girl tightly. After calming down a bit, the boy said that so-and-so would believe her words. Nuna was surprised, but hugged him back and thanked him for it. She was finally able to breathe out a sigh of relief that he believed her after all. In fact, Kieran was incredibly angry. For only a few days ago she had promised to marry him, and already today she had agreed to an engagement to some prince. The guy realized that he couldn't trust her anymore, and if he continued to naively rely on stupid promises, he would just lose her. That's why he intends to find a way to keep her, to come up with something more effective than some promises. They hugged for a while longer, and after that the girl let him go, saying she would be on her way. Kieran smiled and wished her luck, and thought to himself that he would be sure to wait for her. A good deal of time had passed since then, and now at last the day had come when Lady Lemira's betrothal ceremony was to take place. The mother, when she saw her daughter, was surprised and asked if she was worried about anything. The girl immediately replied that she was fine and should not worry. In fact, Nuna had already been living in this place in this girl's body for 9 years, and now she was already 16 years old. A lot of things had happened in that time, but there was still one unresolved problem. The girl thought about the fact that she should already deal with her as soon as possible. In fact, when she went up to her father with the prince at that ball and explained the whole situation, he didn't react the way she expected. The man was adamantly opposed. He said she was too young, and at her age children should be playing for their own pleasure, and they were now talking about marriage. To him it was unthinkable. Many years have passed since then, and now there are hardly any betrothed girls her age left in the Empire at all. She's even afraid that hers won't wait any longer and will simply terminate their marriage contract. The mother turned to her daughter again, and wondered if perhaps she was so saddened by Lady Lemira's behavior. She knows that she has abused her every time they have met. Reyna got angry and said that if she didn't change anything today, she would let Nuna fight with her properly so that she would finally realize her place. The girl immediately began to reassure her mother and told her that she was perfectly fine and the lady had nothing to do with it at all. But mother also said that if she suddenly beat her in the waiting room, they would take full responsibility, so she didn't have to worry about the consequences. Nuna was obviously pleased to hear that, but she said she was really fine and thanked him for his concern, saying she would go already. Mother laughed and said that in that case she could decide for herself. But they did warn her. Kieran, who had recently approached his parents, turned in her direction and wished her luck as well. In fact, the girl didn't even have time to notice that the guy who was always following her had suddenly grown up. He smiled and said that they would be waiting for her in the ceremonial hall. Nuna notices that he is acting very friendly and even good-natured. She doesn't recognize him as the villainous protagonist at all. Sometimes she even misses the cute, cheeky kid he used to be. Soon she finally arrived at the special room where several ladies were gathered. Everyone began to congratulate Lady Lemira on her engagement and talked about how beautiful she looked. Esmeralda was also present there. She too had grown up and looked incredibly beautiful. The girl smiled and congratulated Lady Lemira on her engagement. The hostess of this event thanked her and everyone else for the congratulations. It was a real pleasure for her. Lady Lemira is actually the protagonist of the day. Her family's situation had fallen into disrepair not so long ago, and she was forced to agree to marry a wealthy baron. The girl smiled and turned to Nuna and asked what about her. Was she still not bringing good news to her family? In fact, she had been bullying the poor girl for 9 years without stopping. Lemira, smiling, also said that she was just worried about her and that she shouldn't drag it out or it would be too late. Nuna smiled sweetly back at her and thought about her mother's advice and decided that punching her once wouldn't be so bad. But she behaved honorably and said that the girl was quite right. But the Duke of Eyster was overprotective of her. She chuckled and thought about how incredibly well she was able to attack noble society with her status. Life had taught her a lot, and most importantly, how to stand up for herself. When Nuna looked at her rival, she saw that she was incredibly angry. The girl was silent for a while, and then looked at her hand and pointed her finger at her bracelet. She started screaming and said that it was her day after all, and Nuna looked so flashy. She thinks it's too much. Nuna was a little surprised, but then apologized, saying she hadn't thought, and also asked if she would let her leave it somewhere during the ceremony, and began to remove it from her hand. Lady Lemira, when she heard this, immediately smiled and said that it was a great idea. Since she was the person responsible for this celebration, she could entrust him to her, and in turn, Nuna would leave him in the waiting room so that no one would touch him. Soon, when all the girls had dispersed, Lemira was alone and standing in front of the mirror, humming some tune. She started to put the bracelet on her arm, thinking about how she didn't even doubt that expensive jewelry looked good on her. She laughed and thought that Nuna was an incredible simpleton for being able to trust people so easily. In fact, Lady Lemira had always dreamed of becoming a crown princess or duchess. However, as can be seen, all her efforts were in vain, and it was not in her character to put up with an unfortunate fate, and that's why she started blaming someone else for all her troubles. And it just so happened that that person was Nuna. As the girl slipped the expensive bracelet of her most sworn enemy onto her arm, she thought about how it looked incredibly good on her, and even said it out loud. Then Lady Lemira suddenly heard someone's voice behind her. It belonged to a man who stood in the passage and said that she was quite right. The girl immediately turned there to see who it was, and when she saw Count Kirill in front of her, she immediately hid her hand behind her back. The man came closer to her and asked her why she was hiding the bracelet in the first place. He also smiled and said that the bracelet really suited her. When she heard those words, she was incredibly surprised. She didn't think that the Count could talk to her at all, for he had avoided her all the time before. But then suddenly he stood up and said that he was actually quite upset. The girl blushed a little and asked him what he was upset about. Kieran replied that he had been terribly disappointed when he heard of her engagement, and was also very saddened by the news. Lady Lemira, when she heard this, was ready to scream. Her expression was incredibly unnatural, and she stared in surprise at the Count who had said those words to her. It was a wonderful moment when Lady Lemira's long-held dream finally came true and became a reality. She remained silent for a while longer, then suddenly wondered why he was only talking about it now. She had admired him for a long time too. Her whole body trembled, but then she lifted her head up and said that it was a shame, but her engagement would take place that day. But if he really would be willing to wait just a little while, she was willing to take action. Kieran smiled and told her not to worry, because it was fine. Her situation was a great excuse to show everyone their sincere love. Tears even came to the girl's eyes, and she looked at him in surprise, asking what kind of love we were talking about. The man's voice became level and cold, and he said that bracelet. He would be glad if she wore it to the ceremony. They would just flaunt it, hiding from everyone. Some time had passed since then. The guests had already started to take their seats at the small tables. Nuna, who was sitting next to Esmeralda, saw Kieran finally approach and wondered where he had been disappearing to. The girl smiled happily and said hello to the Count. The man didn't answer anything, only continued to sit down next to them. Nuna was still concerned. She suddenly put her hand on his cheek and said that he had a very strange complexion and asked if he was healthy at all. The guy smiled, took her hand and replied that he was fine and thanked her for her concern. Nuna stared at his face in surprise for a while and then took her seat, thinking that he had really become a real man. She hadn't even noticed how he had grown so fast. Then she began to remember the plot and realized that there was likely not much time left before the main development. But at that moment their reflections were interrupted by the voice of Lady Lemira, who addressed all the guests, thanking them for their presence. She announced that on this day they were celebrating the birthday of a new love. Lady Lemira looked at Kieran and hoped that their union would be strong and long-lasting. Nuna looked at her in surprise and couldn't understand why she kept looking in their direction. She couldn't understand why Lemira was wearing her bracelet or what she was saying. She shifted her gaze to her fiancé, who was standing nearby, and noticed that he was uncomfortable as well. Lady Lemira continued to speak, expressing her hope that her guests would support their new love. Then the event organizer said the newlyweds could light candles to signify their long and happy love. Lady Lemira took the candle with her fiancé, but she wasn't sure she was ready to do so. The man took her hand and told her to be careful. However, the girl only missed her candlestick, and the whole tablecloth began to blaze with bright flames. The groom was very frightened and jumped aside, while the girl just watched it all. Nuna, seeing what was happening, immediately ran in her direction, for the flames quickly switched to her dress and bracelet. The girl was screaming that the scene was on fire and asking for help, but she couldn't do anything herself. She was getting worse as she tried to put out the fire. Then Nuna, who reacted the fastest, picked up a glass of water and immediately splashed it in the girl's face. The guests calmed down when they saw that the girl was fine, and Nuna exhaled with relief. She didn't want to see the victim. Lady Lemira was a very ungrateful woman. She stood all wet and blamed the girl. Esmeralda approached them, but Lemira paid no attention to her, pointing her finger at Nuna and demanding that she confess now if it was any of her business. She asked what the girl had done to her beautiful bracelet and why it had caught fire. But Esmeralda turned her attention to Nuna's hand and to the jewelry. She grabbed Nuna's hand and told her it wasn't her bracelet, but one belonging to Lady Lemira, and Esmeralda immediately asked if Nuna had borrowed it and allowed her to use it. Nuna was very surprised and said that she had said that the jewelry was too flashy for such a ceremony, and convinced Lemira to leave it in her room for safekeeping. She promised that no one would touch it. Lady Lemira suddenly laughed nervously and said that it seemed like there was something else she should know. She looked at Kieran, who had walked over to Nuna, and told him to explain everything. The girl was possessed and started screaming, saying that he was the one who asked her to wear that bracelet. But the man made a surprised and cold face, saying that he didn't even understand what he was talking about. Lady Lemira was very surprised, as if struck on the head with a stone, or stabbed in the heart from the back, and asked why he was not telling the truth. At this point, Esmeralda stepped forward and asked for the spectacle to stop. reminding them that they had all seen her take the bracelet from Nuna. She insulted her with her gratuitous claims and tried to defend her position by throwing accusations at her. Esmeralda asked if she was ashamed of all this. Lady Lemira felt terrible, realizing that she had to leave as soon as possible. So she ran towards the exit, accompanied by the surprised looks of the guests who couldn't understand how she could do such a thing. Nuna stood still, surprised, and thought that such occasions in noble society were really impossible to get used to. In fact, in their world, only one status mattered. The people started talking at once, not knowing if she was ashamed to look at all in the eyes of the others now, and how the Countess could have brought her up so badly. These people pretend to be very benevolent, but in fact, it costs them absolutely nothing to betray a person. The high society is a separate world, where allies can instantly become the worst enemies, and that's no secret to Nuna for a long time. The truth, however, made her very tired. In fact, the girl was not angry with Lady Lemira at all. She only wished that she would stop acting like this. At that moment, she bent down and picked up her expensive bracelet from the floor. Then she wondered if they had been cruel to this girl. After all, she was now hated by the whole of society. Kieran, who had been watching the girl all this time, became a little upset. He realized that she would blame herself again. He didn't understand how she could be so kind to him. He put his arm around the girl's shoulder and offered to go, and she didn't mind. She didn't want to stay at this event any longer. Soon they began to walk down the street, which was already getting dark, and Nuna thanked Kieran. She once again for her help. The man smiled and said that she might not thank him. After all, they were family, and he should be helping her. And then again, at some point, the girl had just taken to noticing that Kieran's attitude toward her had subtly changed. He began to behave much more consciously, learned manners, and there was not even a trace of his sharp temper and childish emotionality left. She realizes that the reason for all this is growing up. However, she still can't get rid of the feeling that some invisible wall has grown between them. They walked a little farther, and the girl inquired how he had managed it at all, and also why Lady Lemira had come out with her bracelet. He thought for a moment, and then said that realizing such a thing was not easy, even for him. She smiled and asked, "Is it really so?" Kieran put his hand to his forehead and made himself a victim, saying that he wasn't good at lying at all, after all, so it wasn't an easy task. However, Nuna thought it was funny, because right now he was lying to her face and not even blushing. After a while of silence, the guy smiled and said that he thought he deserved the praise, because he really had to work hard to make this plan a reality. The girl looked at him and smiled, thinking that sometimes he reminded her of that child. She ruffled his hair and asked, "Does he really think he wants praise? Then they can have something nice to eat when they get home, since he really put in a lot of effort." Kieran did not object to this suggestion. Soon afterward, when they got home, they did eat some sweets. Then Nuna went to her study and sat down to her papers. The girl had absolutely everything under control. She just needed to try again to talk to the Duke about the engagement, and then everything would be fine. In fact, she was incredibly grateful to Hertz for such a wonderful opportunity. When the girl finished writing the letter, she stretched and didn't understand why she couldn't make this engagement work, because it wasn't as bad as her father thought it would be. She feels like she has almost no time left before the plot begins, and she and Kieran, as luck would have it, have begun to drift apart again. Nuna sighed heavily as she thought about it and realized that she was not one step closer to being independent. The girl started to walk towards the bed, thinking about the fact that she had so much excitement that she wouldn't even be able to sleep. She grabbed her robe from there and went out into the hallway to get some fresh air before going to bed. However, Kieran, who had also stepped out into the corridor, saw that she had left her office. He was immediately curious as to what she was doing there so late at night, so he went in and immediately saw a letter on the table. When he saw to whom it was addressed, he sighed heavily and realized that everything was as it was supposed to be. Nuna was very determined to get engaged to this guy. However, for two lovers who are ready to forgive them together fire and water, their correspondence seems too dry to him. Shortly afterward, Kieran left the study, and going to the window, suddenly saw the girl walking in the garden. He noticed that she was suffering from insomnia more and more often, and this alarmed him. He leaned against the wall and thought about the fact that upsetting their beautiful plans wouldn't be as hard as he'd thought it would be. So pretty soon, he wanted to get to work on that. Soon, when the girl finally returned from her walk, she immediately took a hot bath and returned to her bedroom. She sighed happily and thought that taking a bath was the right thing to do, and assumed she could finally get some sleep. At that moment, however, she suddenly heard someone knocking on the door. Nuna was madly surprised, for it was already quite late. She immediately went over and opened the door, asking who it was. But then she saw Kieran in front of her and was very surprised. The man looked very sad and said he couldn't sleep, so he asked her to help her tuck him in. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked him what he meant by it. But the guy, coming into the room, answered that she also sleeps very badly, and he will help her to sleep, and she, in turn, will help him. Nuna quickly started blocking his path, told him he wasn't allowed to pass, and also asked who it was he was going to lull to sleep, and wondered how old he was, generally why he couldn't fall asleep on his own. The guy suddenly stopped and said in a sad voice that he had a nightmare and was just really scared. When he looked her straight in the eye and asked if she would so rudely push her only sibling away at a time when he needed her so badly. Nuna, seeing his beautiful face, thought that he might not even be thinking, for his charm would not work on her. So she said that she did not want to offend him, but that he could not stay the night with her. When the guy started yelling, said that they were a family after all and should help each other in difficult moments, she didn't understand at all how this happened. But in a minute they were lying under the same blanket next to each other in bed. Nuna lay awake and thought about the fact that she had lost this battle again. Kieran had grown up, but he was still a beggar, and now she thought that she didn't think of him as an adult at all. The girl rolled over onto her other side to be away from him, and when Kieran noticed this, he immediately turned to her. He, lying on his back and looking somewhere off to the side, asked if she was still worried, or if the failed engagement was why she was being tormented, that horrible insomnia every night. Nuna, when she heard this, was immediately wary. She started playing with her hair and said that she was really a little worried that everyone around her was getting married, and she wasn't allowed to do it at all. Kieran usually got nervous as soon as the subject of her marriage came up, and now the girl was very surprised that he had started the conversation himself. They were silent for a while, and then the boy said that if she wanted to, he could even help her. Nuna was very surprised and immediately turned to him, asking what he was going to help her with. Kieran was already lying down and looking her straight in the eyes. He replied that he could help with her engagement. He would discuss it with her father. When the girl heard this, she couldn't even contain her surprise and shouted out and asked if he was really ready to do it already. The boy only nodded in response. Nuna thought that it was likely that his words would see the Duke, and he would finally give his permission. She lay back on the bed and said that she would be very grateful to him. But she also wondered why he had suddenly decided to help her. Kieran, still smiling, said it wasn't that simple. He had one more condition. She immediately turned around to listen to him carefully. The boy, in turn, put his hand on her cheek. He said in a very stern voice that he wished that when the girl became an adult she should be able to leave this duchy. Nuna, when she heard this, was very surprised and could not even contain this surprise in herself. He, in turn, smiled and asked her if she agreed. The girl thought at that moment that this was the way her destiny had been planned, to die by his hand. However, if she was kicked out, their fates might not even cross. She was silent for a while, and then smiling, she said that she agreed. She would do it if he would help with her engagement. Kieran started to roll over to the other side of his bed and said that in that case, they had a deal. They lay in silence for a while longer. Then the man spoke again, saying that when she got married, he wondered if they would stop being a family. Nuna was in great pain to answer that question. She was in tears and she couldn't even answer. She didn't even know why she was crying. Everything was going absolutely according to plan. But the girl didn't understand why in such a case she was so very upset. The next morning the father, after talking with his son, called Nuna to his house and told her that she was really 16 years old now. It seemed like only yesterday they'd brought her home. A very small girl, barely reaching the top of her head to his knee. But she was all grown up now. So after a while of silence, he said he was giving his permission for the engagement after all. When the girl heard this, she was very happy and even a little surprised, so she immediately thanked her father for it. He smiled and said that he was always happy to help his daughter. The man also said that she should know that even after the wedding she would be able to return to her home at any time. She will always be welcome here, and will always be helped in case of emergency. Nuna was starting to get a little worried, so she was silent for a while. But then she smiled and thanked her father for it. And just like that, her long-held dream came true. The long-awaited engagement was finally realized with her father's permission. Esmeralda arrived at the manor shortly afterward and ran up to her friend and congratulated her heartily, for it was indeed very happy news. She smiled and said that she knew very well that she had had a hard time and she was very much worried about her. Now, however, she was much calmer with morals. Nuna felt a little uncomfortable, but she thanked her friend for all those words. But at that moment the Marquise Margianini appeared behind her, and she asked in a stern voice that the girl should accept her congratulations. Nuna immediately turned in her direction and said hello to the Marquise. The woman stepped forward and said that she had always thought she and the prince would make a lovely couple. Then she glimpsed Esmeralda and said that she wished she had a good part at last. The girl smiled and said that she was absolutely sure that Esmeralda would meet the most marvelous young man, and thought of her brother, went to say that it would even be the protagonist of the novel. Then she suddenly remembered Kieran, and noticed that he hadn't been home for several days. She'd expected him to show up for the engagement party, though, because he'd made it happen. Marquise suddenly turned to the girl and said that Count Kieran had not been seen this day for some reason. She smiled and said that the girl must be very upset that he hadn't honored her with his presence on such an important day. After all, he was a brother. Nuna smiled and said that she was well aware that he was very busy lately, so she hadn't even expected that he might come. So she wasn't too upset, but it was really a lie. She thought about the fact that after that night, he probably didn't consider her his sister anymore, because she never said whether or not she and her family would even be together after her engagement. She had simply remained silent. The guests were walking, having fun and dancing. The mother greeted her daughter with tears in her eyes and began to congratulate her, for it was a great happiness for her. Then after a while, Nuna finally approached her fiancé. He turned to her at once and smilingly told her that he would take care of her and she could trust him. He would not let her down. The girl smiled and said that he had always been kind to her, and that on the contrary, she should try her best not to embarrass him. In fact, she knew she would always be indebted to Herson. Their engagement was the instant solution to all her problems. All that remained was to cope with the role of bride, and all would be well. Suddenly the guy looked at his fiancée's face and wondered what was wrong with her, for she looked rather strange. He did not take his eyes off Nuna, and said anxiously that her face looked as if she were about to cry. The girl laughed nervously and said that she must have gotten too emotional, because she was so happy that she was finally getting married. The prince also laughed and said that in that case, he too was incredibly happy. But he would still hold back his tears. In fact, the girl managed to come to her senses only after the ceremony. What dress she was wearing, what she had eaten, and what presents she had received, she remembered absolutely nothing because of her inner turmoil. Soon when the ceremony was over, the Duke stayed the night at the manor. He started to go into his bedroom when he heard footsteps behind him. He immediately turned around and saw Count Kieran in front of him, bowed in turn, greeted the prince, and said he was pleased to finally meet. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked if he had something going on, and wondered why he had suddenly come to his room. The guy in turn looked around and said that he really got quite cozy. And spacious room, seems that his mother did a great job. He was very lucky. The prince was wary, and then wondered if that was all he wanted to say to him in the middle of the night. But he only smiled and was silent for a while. Then the lad said, in a cold and confident voice, that as far as he knew, the prince intended to use the engagement to his sister to accomplish his own political ends. The prince was silent for a while. He tried not to let his emotions show on his face, and then simply said that he didn't understand at all what the man was talking about. Kieran in turn came closer and said that he did not believe in any preordained fate, I remember their first meeting had taken place at the festival about 9 years ago, and he suddenly wondered how many times he had met his sister since that ball. Did he really mean to say that he had feelings for her? I mean, that's unthinkable. They had only met once, after dancing, and he had already offered her hand in marriage and waited until the very last moment instead of finding someone else. The guy said that most likely all he saw in her was her high status. Although he wouldn't argue, his sister has other virtues to love because of. Hersa was silent for a while, and then clenched his hand into a fist and said that he was quite right. Not quite, however. After all, they had made a pact with her. The boy, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what kind of agreement they were talking about. Prince said they had a special deal. Now, however, things have changed. He harbors the most sincere feelings for her sister and is willing to marry her for love, not just some contract for his own gain. He moved closer to Kieran and said that perhaps his liking for her had been real all along. But it didn't matter, because she was his fiancée now. He put his hand on his shoulder and said that now he was at a loss as to why he was so hostile to him. They would soon be relatives. But here stepped aside and said that he was even glad that it had no effect on Nuna's decision to marry him, and if it did, he shouldn't back out either. She had waited all this time, and she had waited for her prince. He began to step aside and asked that the Duke should finally leave his peace already, and after all, he wants to rest after a hard day. Kieran smiled and started to step aside, but before he left, he wondered what they should do now. After all, he felt the same way about her. At this very moment, Nuna was in her chambers, unable to sleep. She didn't understand how she could not come to her sister's engagement party. It still made her very angry. She lay back on the bed and didn't know if it was okay to be upset about this. After all, she had her own fiancé now, and she shouldn't worry about it at all. But then she interrupted herself again and thought that her worries were justified. He was her only brother after all, and he could at least show up for a moment at the engagement party and congratulate her. Nuna lay down on the bed again and, turning over, thought about the upside of the situation. It would be much easier for her to break off the relationship. But she quickly shifted from that thought and stood to her feet, thinking about the fact that his behavior still annoyed her terribly, and there was no way she could understand why it was necessary to do so. And so, as she was about to make her way into the room to do something, Kieran suddenly walked in just as she was about to do it and turned to her. He wanted to go further and further, and said it was an incredible blessing that she was still awake. Nuna turned in his direction and smiled, wondering if something was wrong with him. She was actually very worried that he had hurt her, and that was why he had come. The guy stepped closer to her and started coughing, then turned away and said that he actually wanted to apologize for not showing up for the ceremony. It was very rude of him. Nuna felt uncomfortable about it. She realized that he had definitely heard her speech. And then she told him not to worry, because everything had gone fine without his presence. In fact, she was still incredibly angry with him. But the guy still wasn't going to agree with her, and said she didn't look happy at all. She turned her head and said she was actually in a wonderful mood. It had just been a very long day, but it had been fun at the same time. But still the girl is very tired. So she even felt like she was about to fall. So she wondered if he could go away and leave her alone to rest. Kieran was very surprised and said that he had actually prepared a gift for her as an apology, but apparently she didn't need it at all since she was chasing him away. Guy sighed heavily and said it was a shame because he was wonderful, magical. She would have loved him. Nuna, when she heard this, laughed nervously and said that since he had made such an effort, she would gladly accept his gift, only for him not to be upset. The guy in turn smiled smugly and leaned closer to her and asked if she was really ready for him. Nuna nodded in agreement. Then he started to move closer to her, and even took her by the waist. The girl was afraid that something bad was about to happen, so she closed her eyes. After a while, however, she felt that they were in some other place. She immediately opened her eyes and saw that they were outside. Nuna looked around and saw that he had somehow carried her deep into the forest, straight to a small lake that gleamed beautifully in the moonlight. Kieran in turn set her on the ground and wondered what she thought of his such a modest gift. He laughed nervously and said it was probably not at all what she might have expected. He hoped, however, that she would be able to appreciate his gift. Nuna quickly interrupted him and said sincerely that she really loved it. He looked at her in surprise, and the girl repeated her words and smiled and said that she really liked the gift. It's gorgeous, and she didn't expect him to be able to do something like this. Then, after some time of silence, he said that, to be honest, he wasn't really sorry for not coming to her engagement party. When she heard this, she was very surprised and did not understand how it could be. But Kieran put his head down and said that he was really only sorry that he couldn't dance with her at this celebration. Then he stretched his hand forward and asked if he could ask her to dance now. Nuna laughed and said that so be it, he would have a special privilege, and put her hand in his as a sign of consent. When without music, but with pleasant emotions, the two of them began to dance on the bank of this shining river. In fact, sometimes the girl is genuinely puzzled how such a sweet and kind Kieran can turn into a cruel protagonist about whom she read in the novel. She really just can't believe it.